Okay, folks. So tonight I'm talking with Nick Larray, who is in the Channel Islands, and he's going to be talking about his interest in the history of the islands and his interest in history in any case. It's a pleasure to have him with us because he's also a blogger, and it's a very interesting site, and we're going to plug it later for the Fallout friends and patrons, and give it lots of coverage because there's some really interesting content on there for all our friends. So, Nick, welcome to Fallout.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you for inviting me on.
It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but it's been a bit of a, yeah. Anyway, so if you would, give us a little bit of a background about your interest in pursuit of history and all the good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Guernsey in the Channel Islands, lived here all my life. I have worked away, but it's always been just for a few weeks at a time. I spent quite a lot of time doing 2 weeks here, 2 weeks in London in the 90s for about 3 years until I decided that whilst it was exciting to start off with, I got a bit fed up of it. So my interest is really that, I had relatives that were here during the occupation. As your background shows, we've got an awful lot of fortifications that are around the islands. You can't get away with them. There's concrete everywhere, which a few people take the mickey out of me for, because I am interested in, what they were used for. So I've gradually collected lots and lots of information over the years. And it was actually when I was at the We Have Ways Fest, people started about the Channel Islands, the occupation, because outside of the islands and a few people, that there's not really that much that's known. You get the odd TV program and things, and people said you really should do something with this. So I thought, yeah, maybe I should. There's also a lot of information that is coming out that when most of the books were written, immediately after the occupation, even up to the 90s and early 2000s, you just couldn't get access to the stuff that was in the National Archive, for instance, or even in the archives here. So there's a lot of stuff that has come out since, which actually explains a lot of things that were left unanswered. So I thought, I'll address those. It's an interesting thing to do. I've 6 months ago started a podcast with a friend of mine who's also a keen interest in the occupation, Keith Pengelly. And what we're doing is a month by month look at what was going on in the islands, more from the point of view of the islanders themselves, and also about what the Germans were getting up to while they were here. But, how was it impacting them on a social level? The various, all the rules and regulations that came out, the hardships that they caused, and how that affected people throughout the occupation. So that's really where I got to. I got persuaded to write the blog because a few people said to me, you should write all this stuff down because it'll get lost otherwise. And I thought, well, nobody's really going to be interested. And they were trying to persuade me to write a book, and I said, no, I haven't got time for that. So then I got talked into writing a blog, which they said, it won't take you anywhere near as much time as writing a book. How foolish of me to believe them on that one. I do spend an awful lot of time on research. And it's really interesting because they turn up stuff that people just haven't written about before. And because you'll find something in the archives quite often, you end up, I'm sure you do the same, you'll be reading one document, it will refer to something that you weren't actually researching. But you think, hang on, that sounds interesting. I've not heard anything about that. I need to go find out some more about that. And so it sort of went from there. And then in December, I actually gave in, and I was approached to write a book. So I'm in the midst of that at the moment. And the deadline is looming now because that's got to be in for January. But that's dealing with a specific aspect of the occupation. That's dealing with people who escaped from the islands during the war, of which there were quite a few. And it looks at their motives, why they did it, a variety of different motives. One that really, really makes me laugh is basically that the straw that broke the camel's back for one chap and his mates was they went into a cafe and some Germans who came in after them were served with cups of tea before they were, and that was it. He wrote a detailed account about how that was the final straw, and then he risked everything to escape to the UK along with some of his friends, which was a very risky undertaking, and they very nearly got caught. So yeah, so I'm pretty busy doing all those sort of things, and occasionally do a bit of tour guiding as well.
Cool. I mean, that sounds fascinating. We're going to have to watch out for your book, and when it comes out, you have to come and talk to us about it. So that's
Absolutely.
great. So just give us an impression from your perspective to those of us who don't live on the islands, don't understand them, look at their proximity to Cherbourg and think, okay.
Yeah, how did we end up British? This really confuses people, and I can understand why, because as you say, we're much closer to the Cherbourg Peninsula. I mean, if you look at the most northerly island, Orkney, it's 8 miles away from Cherbourg. I can see this. I can see if I walk across the park at the end of my road. I can quite clearly see the French coast. It's about 30 miles away ish. And so we are very close to France. You're looking at 80 miles to the nearest point on the UK. So a lot of people go, well, how did you end up British? It's a long historical story that dates back to 1066. Originally, the islands were Norman, and then things progressed from there. Obviously, William the Conqueror went to England, and then there's a whole load of stuff that happened after that. In the few hundred years after that, and Normandy was ceded back to France, but we were left with the UK. So we're in an unusual position because we're not part of the UK. We're a British Crown dependency. We're part of the British Isles. Our allegiance is to the Crown as the Duke of Normandy, rather than anything else. So we make our own legislation here. The UK is responsible for our defence and some aspects of international relations, albeit our local government does a lot of work with the French government because they're our next door neighbour. So that's kind of how we ended up where we are. So yeah.
Do you have your own diplomats?
We do. But we have politicians here who act in a diplomatic capacity when they go to France. So we negotiate deals, trade deals and things like that with France. Obviously, we didn't get a vote in Brexit because we don't vote in UK elections. We have our own government here, so we didn't get any say in what happened with Brexit, and probably the less said about that, the better. From our perspective, because it has caused a few problems for us.
How do you think the islands would have responded to Brexit? Do you think they voted against it?
Yeah, I think they would have voted against it, to be honest, because of the close connections, with France. I think they probably would have. Who knows? But that's my gut instinct is we would have done, just because of the close connections. If you wander around the streets here, all the road names are either French or our local language, Jersey, which is a derivation of Norman French. So, for example, a lot of our laws were written in French or in Guernsey French, and the ones that haven't been updated have an English translation on one side of the page, the original French on the other side, and my understanding is that the French version is the definitive. If there's an argument about the translation, the French version is the definitive bit. So all of our lawyers here that are allowed to appear in court, they have to become advocates of the royal court here. Then to do that, they have to go to Caen in France and go to the university there for essentially what is a history lesson. They go for 6 months and study Norman law. So there is that aspect. There's lots of quirky things like that.
Is that like the French Codex?
Yeah, a
Sorry,
little bit like that.
yeah, okay, I understand.
Yeah. So they go to Cornell University, they study there for 6 months as part of, they're all people that have got a law degree already and a qualified solicitor or barrister, but they go there to do that training. COVID saw that change to being done online. I'm not quite sure how it works now, whether people still go to Cornell or not. But that's how close our connection is there. And obviously the surnames like mine, Lahure. My family came over from France in the late 1790s when they decided they quite liked their head connected to the rest of their body.
Yeah,
And
I can understand that.
and there were an awful lot of French people who did that. Of course, because French was fairly widely spoken here as well, so it wasn't particularly difficult for them. Probably the most famous French resident we had was Victor Hugo, of course.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
so that's how we end up with place names that people struggle with if they're not from the island, because they might be spelt one way, but they're pronounced a completely different way, which causes much amusement for some people. But the surnames, a lot of them are French derived surnames.
So it's a more complex relationship than just saying, well, we're British or we're European. We're actually something very distinct between the two, with all its own cultural.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we have British passports, but they are bailiwick of Guernsey in my case, bailiwick of Jersey for the folks that live over in Jersey. So it's a different passport. Pre-Brexit, if you didn't have any connection to the UK, inside your passport, it would say this person does not have the rights to reside in the EU and work there, because you were just, if your family hadn't, ever lived in the UK, then you weren't entitled to go in the EU.
Okay.
It's just one of those quirks, just because we weren't part of the UK. Now, for a lot of people, that wasn't a problem, because with people having been evacuated to the UK during the occupation, before the occupation started, or they volunteered to go and serve in the British forces, then that ceased to be a problem, because they had a parent or a grandparent who'd been born in the UK or lived in the UK. So, but that's just another one of the quirks, really.
Okay. So if we kind of talk about the history bit, and we're primarily talking about the Second World War, what, from your perspective, what's actually the more interesting, the actual occupation or the fortifications, or as you're doing now, the research on the people who escaped? Is there a specific area that you particularly like and are interested in, or is it the whole thing?
It's kind of the whole thing. I mean, one bit that I've looked at quite a bit is just the run up to it, which is just fascinating in itself. Because the British government decided in 1925 that the islands were of no strategic use to either them or any potential enemy. Which, interestingly enough, the country that they figured was a potential enemy that might want the Channel Islands was the French. In 1925, it's incredible. But what they did have, there were troops based here. There was a local militia that was here, right up to quite close to the Germans arriving. Actually, they left in the middle of June, pretty much overnight. They just packed up and went. But the whole debate around, I've written an article on it because I just find it's just really interesting, because you read the War Cabinet minutes, and in particularly in June, they'll make a decision in the morning at a meeting saying, right, we're going to send more troops to defend the Channel Islands. By the early afternoon, they said, oh, maybe we'll just send a few. And then by the end of the day, they've gone, no, we're not sending any, we can't defend them. And then they carry on that debate again and again, day after day. Churchill was particularly annoyed about the concept of abandoning the islands. He really didn't want to. And he had to be persuaded that it was the right thing to do. It would have been slaughter if they tried to defend them. The Germans could have just nipped across from Cherbourg and bombed the living daylights out of their leisure, whilst the RAF would have had the problem at that stage that any fighter aircraft would have only had about 15 minutes over the Channel Islands before they had to go back to the UK to refuel. Plus, they, of course, couldn't afford at that point to be using aircraft for that when they were going to have to get involved in the Battle of Britain. So it's a really complex area, but I found it really interesting, just the different personalities that were involved. And it carries on throughout the occupation because Churchill is just desperate to find out what's going on. Any chance we can get the islands back? They go through a whole load of really detailed planned operations. Churchill sent a Guernseyman, Hubert Nicol. So Guernsey was occupied on the 30th of June after the Germans did bomb Guernsey and Jersey on the 28th of June because they hadn't been told the islands had been demilitarized. Because the British government were in a kind of, what do we do? They'll just walk in if we tell them. And so they were sort of trying to work out what they were going to do about that. Events overtook them. They got bombed and a number of people were killed. And a lot of people were badly injured, unfortunately, because there was a sort of public meeting going on in St. Peter Port at the time about whether people were going to leave or not. So that was unfortunate. But so the Germans arrived in Guernsey on the 30th of June, Jersey on the 1st of July, and 4th of June, Hubert Nicol gets hauled into Whitehall because Churchill wants somebody to come here and find out what the hell's going on. How many Germans are there? What's going on? Can we do anything about it? And there were a number of commando raids in 1940 that had varying success, stroke not success. One was Operation Ambassador, which had 140 men took part in it. It went horribly wrong. They got lost. The boats, one of the boats ended up on the wrong island. Another one that was just completely lost at sea because their compasses went awry and tidal conditions were wrong.
You talked about the commando raids on WW2 TV, didn't you, some time ago?
Yeah, I did. I talked to Woody about those. They're quite interesting because they had a number of impacts for the islanders, not least that by early 1941, nobody could go anywhere around the coast pretty much. You couldn't go on the beaches. You had to stay away. A lot of areas were mined. But Churchill, interestingly, after the Ambassador one in middle of 1940, he said, let's not have any more fiascos like this, and then is promptly sending commandos over again in September. But I talked to Woody as well. I'll just quickly cover this because obviously if anybody wants to find out more about the commando raids, they can go look that one up. But Mountbatten was keen to get the islands back as well, and he was egging on Churchill. And they came up with their initial plan was Operation Attaboy in March 41. They were initially these all looked remarkably similar in the way that they come up with ideas for them. They looked at taking back all of the islands. Then they decided, well, that's not really going to work. Let's go for Alderney. That'd be handy because it's near France. Then they were going to take it and hold it. Then they were going to take it and hold it for a week. Then that turned into, well, we'll take it and hold it for a day, and which I really don't understand the point of that one. And they repeated these. There were all the way up to 43. There were plans to do these sort of things, which got to varying different levels. Some of the training that was done for Operation Blazing was then used to go on to other things like Dieppe and things like that. And then they did have a plan at the end of the war to try and come and take the islands back by force. They really didn't want to. But when you look at those, it's frightening what would have happened because they were talking about using about 1,000 aircraft to bomb the islands for a couple of days before they were going to try and take them back. There would have been no, the islands are made out of granite. There's nowhere to go and hide. The Germans probably would have had a better chance of surviving in their bunkers. It just would have been awful. And just fighting to take them back would have been just an absolute nightmare.
Well, one thing that occurs to me, you were talking about it being a crown territory and all of that kind of story. So was the defence of the islands before they actually demilitarised? Were the defence of the islands under some kind of imperial system, like the British regiments that went overseas to India and what have you? Were troops assigned to the Channel Islands like the imperial system?
Yeah, they get sent here for a couple of years. Particularly, there were a number of Irish regiments that were here, including one who had their silver nicked by the Germans because they left in such a hurry. They left it in the vault at Lloyd's Bank in St. Peterport, and they had a terrible time trying to get. Well, they didn't get all of it back, but they got some of it back post-war. There were things like that. But it was again, it was just really down to there was an agreement that they would defend the islands, and it had been long running. There's a little bit of a quirk as well in that Channel Islanders, because of the allegiance to the Crown, could only be called up to defend either the Crown, the King or Queen, or to defend the islands. You couldn't be forced to join up otherwise. Now, in practical terms, they started changing the law. They changed the law in Jersey first. Then Guernsey looked at it and went, "Hang on, you've made a bit of a cock up here. This really doesn't work." And they were trying to change the law here. But by the time they changed the law, most people of military age had left the islands to go and join up.
Right.
And there were, there's always been a strong affiliation to the British forces here. So my grandfather, my mother's dad, was in the Royal Navy. He joined in boy service back in the day when they used to take you as a 16-year-old or whatever. So he'd already been in the Royal Navy for a number of years. And my other grandfather promptly resigned from the militia here and got on a boat and went to the UK and joined the Royal Artillery. So although they couldn't actually force anybody to go, there was no need for it anyway, because people, most people of military age had gone, and quite a few that tried to join up who were well past military age went and were most disappointed when they weren't allowed to join up in the UK. So yeah, it's a bit of a quirk.
I mean, I understand from a relative of mine that the Isle of Man had its own regiment, which was turned into a flak regiment.
Yeah.
Was there a Channel Islands regiment? I mean, you mentioned the militia. Yeah.
So what happened? This dates back to the First World War. So during the First World War, the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry and the Jersey equivalent went and fought in 1917, and there was massive casualties because they were all in the same regiment, and it pretty much wiped out a generation who were either killed or so badly wounded that they died, very young, and it caused real problems. So after that, it was decided that in the event of war, the local militias would disband, and people would go and join up themselves in the UK. The idea being to spread them around a little bit. Now that kind of works because people join to different forces, as in they'll join the RAF or join the Royal Navy, whatever. However, an awful lot of Channel Islanders did end up in the Hampshire Regiment. So there was a fair concentration of them, and partly because of that, it was very easy when the British government were looking for people to send here from the Channel Islands to conduct raids here, or just come and see what's going on, try and gather information, intelligence. It was very easy for them to find them because there was a whole network of them who all knew each other, and it wasn't really a problem to do that. So it was slightly different to the Isle of Man because they'd not had the same experience with the massive loss of life in in 1917. So yeah, it's we've got lots of quirks.
So if there are a significant number joined the Hampshire Regiment, and we know the Hampshire Regiment was involved, or one of the battalions at least was involved in Normandy, is there a link between Normandy and operations and the Channel Islands? Is there a memorial kind of thing?
No, there isn't really. There tend to be just people that we do have lots of war memorials around the island to both world wars, but there's nothing sort of specific dedicated to Normandy.
Okay. No, it's just the idea that there might have been a Hampshire badge, Channel Islands branch sort of thing stuck on the wall, and I was just thinking, no,
yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing actually, because there was a long-running argument. It's quite well documented that Channel Islanders wanted to have effectively their own badge on their uniform, saying that they were either from Guernsey, Jersey, or just Channel Islands. And it was decided that that was not going to be allowed. The British government were like, no, it's not happening. And there were lots of letters written. And you can read some of them, and they're just protesting about the fact they weren't allowed to do it. And then Guernseymen and Jerseymen, being quite stubborn folk, just went ahead and did it anyway. They designed their own and put it on their uniforms, and nobody really tried to put a stop to it.
I had heard something to that effect, which is what I was kind of alluding to, because I think it's just British Tommies on certain things are just not going to have chicken shit.
Yeah. You might tell us we can't do it, but we're going to do it anyway. So.
Yeah,
it's kind of ask for forgiveness, not permission. I think, because a lot of the letters that were written in were actually by family and friends who were evacuated to the UK, who was saying, my son's been told he's not allowed to do this sort of thing. It's outrageous. They should be allowed to identify, like some of the other nationalities, the Free French and people like that. They wanted to be able to do that, so they just went, oh well, never mind, we'll do it anyway.
So I've got a couple of questions, and one is, I don't really want to get into the heavy collaboration, occupation kind of politics, because once that subject's been going on and circulating on and on. What I'm actually interested in, as in terms, if you like, the historiography and the way the direction of the writing has gone. Something that's always intrigued me is, with all of the things that happened in 1945. So when the British came back and Herbert Morrison gave his speech forgiving everybody and all of that stuff, did all of that really help the Channel Islands create their future history, or was that a bit of a hindrance and an obstacle?
I think it probably was a bit of a hindrance. I mean, it depends at how you look at what you class as collaboration, because there was obviously overt collaboration from some people that were just definitely, they were in it for the money. They were collaborating with the Germans for their own means. I mean, there was a Dutch gentleman that lived here who was basically he got control of a lot of the growing businesses, and he was exporting food out of the islands, even though they were desperate for food here, to France and flogging it to the Germans, and he was sucking up to the Germans. And
was that in a black market form? Was that in a black market form, or was that directly?
No, that was in agreement with the Germans, and the local government here at the time. If you read the minutes of their meetings, they very early on start talking about this individual by name and what he's doing, and what can we do about it, sort of thing. Now, people like that did get their comeuppance. Not all of them, but some of them did get their comeuppance come the end of the war, because there was a war profits tax law introduced, which took away a lot of their money. But not everybody got caught by that. I think it was so difficult to prove in a lot of cases if it was, that was an overt case that everybody knew about, and it was just one of those things. But there's other things, like people would say, well, what about all those people that worked for the Germans? Well, particularly by the time you got towards the end of the war, you didn't have a lot of choice. If you wanted to eat or not get sent to prison in Europe, you had to work for the Germans, because all the local businesses were pretty much shut down. There was a lot of the Germans controlled every aspect of life, and they would just turn around to the local government and go, we need 150 men to do this, and they were they pushed back against things, so they stopped work on military projects. It's like, these civilians, you can't make them work on military projects. They did, but they managed to sort of temper that a little bit. But you're on in Guernsey's case, 25 square mile island surrounded by sea. You haven't got a lot of choice about, you can't do anything. And I think Paul Sanders makes a really good point in his book, where he talks about, because one of the criticisms is, there was no resistance, which is just not true. There was no resistance in the form of going around blowing stuff up, or shooting Germans, because A, we had no weapons, they'd all been taken away, and B, that would have been suicide, because you had nowhere to go. They'd soon track you down. What there was, I think Paul calls it defiance. So people did things which, like when all the radios had been taken away, there were two groups of people that got together. They were illegally listening to the BBC, which was very dangerous. They could have found themselves sent to prison, and some of them did in Europe. One of them sadly died, and others were deeply affected by it. But they circulated news sheets of the BBC News so that people had some idea of what was going on. And what one of my favourites to do with that is the way they got around circulating them was, if you went into Lloyd's Bank in St. Peterborough, for example, and asked for the manager and asked the right question, you would be passed a book that you could look at, and you knew where the sheet would be in the book if you were a trusted person. And likewise at one of the libraries, they also distributed them around to people that they trusted as well. So there were things like that. There was also things like, some people volunteered to work for the Germans just so they could actually cause a bit of problems for them by either working very slowly, not doing a good job. There were a bunch called the Matthew Sark Party, who I just think what they did was amazing. There was a German ship that was wrecked off of Sark in 1944, and these guys were basically made to go and they were supposed to go and salvage this boat. They managed to drag it out until the end of the war without salvaging the boat. So it was about 9 months, I think it was. And they just, every obstacle they could put in the way about why they hadn't managed to do it yet, things like that. So there were a lot of things going on like that. But the truth was, you just had no choice, because if you wanted to eat, or your family to eat, you had to, in some way work for the Germans. It was that or die, basically.
I think people don't truly understand, mostly because they don't really study it, is just how horrific occupation is, especially under the Nazis. And also, they don't kind of give credit to things like passive resistance. And I think that's very unfair. I mean, I actually saw a case of passive resistance once during a period of martial law in Poland in 1983. And it was quite remarkable, because the Russian train went through, me and trains. So the train goes through Warsaw, and the Polish railwayman said, no, you can't take a photograph. So I put my camera back in the pocket, and he kind of had his hand on my chest. And then once the train went through, he pushed me back, because suddenly all these people stepped forward and started spitting on the tracks. And I was astonished. And it just really, I just suddenly realized that the impact of passive resistance in such a situation of martial law. You talked about, because I've actually read his book a long time ago. I think it was 2012. Paul Sanders. He made some quite interesting comments about collaboration, didn't he?
He did, yeah, and he takes a more objective view, I think, about what was happening.
The reason I ask you that question is because if we went back to 1995, and I'm going to mention this because I think we both agree we don't like this person, but there was a woman called Madeline Bunting who had written a book and had done research on the Channel Islands situation. And in 1995, she was on all the news programs when the final records were released from the Public Record Office, as it was then known, now the National Archives. And she made all kinds of ugly statements. The one which still kind of echoes in my mind, even now, was she said that all of the people who had slept with Germans and all of the people who had done or participated in collaboration, they would now be named. And I thought that was just the most stupidest thing I'd actually ever heard. So divisive, so unpleasant, so extreme. And now, of course, we've got Paul Sanders' work to reflect on it. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when the Bunting book came out and when she was appearing on TV and things like that, there was just so many mistakes in it. And I've seen some local historians basically went through it and they produced an article which has got a table of, she said this didn't happen because that person was not actually in the islands at the time, or that was just actually impossible for that to have happened for another reason, or there were witnesses to say that didn't happen, and reliable witnesses. So yeah, I just don't. It was a very sensationalist book. She wasn't very objective about what went on, and it was all just to whip up a media frenzy and sell lots of copies of her book, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I mean, her background as a journalist, I don't think that she was particularly looking at it from let's write a true and history of what went on in the Channel Islands. I think it was very much what sort of scandal can I find or infer if I don't actually have any evidence for it, and it caused a lot of upset for people.
I mean, I thought it was a bit of a warning for historians and people in general when you play the history game. You've got to be very, very careful with certain comments that you want to make. I mean, it's easy to say that's a collaborator, that's not a collaborator, blah, blah, blah. But the actual social, cultural effects of making those kind of statements can be quite horrendous.
Yeah, and actually not understanding the position of the person that you're accusing of collaborating. You don't know if you don't understand the pressures that were on them. A multitude of factors that are interacting that make them take those actions. You can't possibly understand all of that without doing an inordinate amount of research, or even, she could have still spoken to some of those people because some of those people would have still been alive. I'm not aware that she particularly did. It's just one of those books that I definitely wouldn't recommend. I speak to a lot of historians who also have read it and just aren't particularly keen on it either. And that's people not from the Channel Islands. That's other well-published historians who just look at it and just say no. Whereas Paul Sanders in his book looks very much more at what was going on in those people's lives, for the civilian population at the time. Why might they have made that decision? What was their other choice? If they hadn't done that, what would they have done? What would the impact have been on them? And I think as well that there's a lot of stuff gets lost because you don't see anyone saying, well, look how many people the Germans put in prison in the Channel Islands for doing things that they didn't like. It got so bad in Guernsey, for example, that you'd end up in a German court martial. They'd sentence you, and then you'd basically be told, well, we'll come and get you when we've got room to stick you in the prison, because and it might be months and months before they could stick you in the prison.
But they know you're not going to run anywhere because there's nowhere to run. Yeah, so you're under a perpetual state of threat. Yeah.
Yeah, they'd be able to find you, and you know, I've seen a list which is acknowledged to be incomplete, but it talks about over 1,900 people in Guernsey being sentenced for crimes against the Germans. Well, when you think there were about 21,000 people left in Guernsey by that point, that's a hell of a lot of people.
Yes.
You know, that have done things to annoy Germans. One of the guys in Jersey that I'm looking at for a book about an escape, he actually, his reason for escaping was he'd got into severe trouble and been sent to prison. I mean, even though he was only a teenager, he'd been sent to prison by the Germans because he'd taken part in a protest, and it had all got a bit ugly because the Germans weren't kind of used to what was going on. Now, hang on a minute. It was around the deportations when they started deporting people, and there was a crowd gathered. He got involved. The Germans didn't really know what to do, so they went for the let's start attacking them. And he actually got a bayonet through his upper right buttock. But he was caught. He escaped, but was caught because he'd had to leave his bicycle at the scene, and they were all registered, so it didn't take them long. But he escaped later on in the occupation, and the whole reason that he wanted to escape was because he'd been warned that he'd come to the attention of the Germans because he'd been doing other things since, and he was going to be arrested within a matter of hours potentially, and he made good his escape.
And here's something that kind of just occurred to me here. Obviously, fishing is very important in the islands, yes?
Yeah.
So were the fishermen allowed to go out on their trawlers, or were they guarded?
Well, this caused there was an escape in September 1940 from Guernsey, which caused a massive problem. These guys got away. There weren't that many Germans here at that point, so they hadn't really got themselves particularly well organised to stop that sort of thing. But after those guys escaped, they basically called all boats into the main harbour. They had to. Most of them were brought up onto land. Even if you had a boat at home in your back garden, had to take it to some people, and they banned all fishing for weeks and weeks. And now they obviously hadn't thought this through, because if you need to feed your troops and you need to feed the civilians, you kind of need to go fishing. So they eventually worked it out, and it was guarded. So initially, what they did was they had patrol boats that went out with the fishermen. They weren't allowed to go more than 3 miles out. If it started getting foggy, they were all rushed back into the harbour. So that sort of continued for a while. Then there were more escapes. Then there was more problems, and they started putting Germans actually on your boat. You'd have a German on your boat. Now, Guernsey and other Channel Islands fishermen particularly thought, well, perhaps we can be a bit of a nuisance here. So they used to do things like going to fish in areas where they wouldn't, you know, in the tidal conditions, they'd have gone, oh, I'm not going there, it's too rough. And of course, you've got a lot of these Germans who are not used to being in a small boat at sea, and so their game was to make them feel as seasick and uncomfortable as possible whilst they were out. There's another cracking story actually about the Germans in Sark, who basically put up a notice saying that fishing was only allowed to take place between 10 and 4. Well, that's fine as long as the tide's right, so you can actually go and fish. And they wondered for about a week. They wondered why they were down at the harbour waiting to put guards on the boats. Where is everybody? Well, you know, and the commander there actually went and complained to Sybil Hathaway, who was the Senier's wife in Sark. You know, why are they not coming? Why are they not coming? And she said, well, it's the wrong tide. They can't go anywhere. It finally dawned on them that, yeah, oh yeah, the tide moves around, it changes. Okay, right. But I just thought that was a brilliant one.
I love it, especially because some of the Germans were Kriegsmarine, weren't they? So
Yeah, they were.
They might have known how tides work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the trouble. Possibly the trouble was a lot of the senior German officers weren't Kriegsmarine. They tended to be the army. So it was there were quite a few instances where they made themselves look quite silly, and we talked about some of those on the podcast there too with Keith. Because I think it's just that when we're talking about some really serious stuff, where people getting locked up for a number of weeks and treated very badly for something that they did. If you've then got a slightly lighter story about something that happened in the same month, it kind of makes it a little bit less depressing about what people do to each other. That they did make some absolutely idiotic decisions, and it's great because there are a lot of unpublished diaries which you can now get access to that people wrote at the time. They just record their thoughts for that day. There's some really good published ones as well. The Reverend Douglas Ord, that book, his diary was published a few years ago. John Nettles, aka Bergerac, John's got a great interest in the history of the Channel Islands, particularly the occupation, and he actually he was involved in getting that book published. And that's a great source because Douglas Ord spoke German. He'd fought in the First World War. He was a fluent German speaker. He was obviously he was a vicar. Germans came and confided in him in his role as the vicar, and told them their worries and things like that. So he had a bit more of an insight into what they were thinking as well. So he's quite a good source. He also loved. There were so many rumours because people just didn't. When there were no radios, supposedly, apart from the ones that people had illicitly, rumours would start about what's going on in the island, and or somebody would see something, and by the time it was 22nd hand, the rumour had been passed on. It had changed from one thing to something completely and utterly different. And Ord's really good because he writes down all these rumours that he's heard when he's been walking around town, or after church services when people have said to him, have you heard? And he makes a note about it. Oh, this sounds like a ridiculous rumor, or there might be some truth in this. And then you'll see a few days later he'll have got to the bottom of what actually happened, or whether it was just complete work of fiction that somebody had come up with. And frankly, I mean, they had very little that they could actually do. So, coming up with these sort of things. They were also done, actually, some of them were done maliciously towards the Germans. So people would start a rumor and the Germans would start worrying about things. They get worried and they waste resources doing things. There's a place over here called Les Marais, which looks like it could be somebody's name. It could be somebody called Les. There's a recorded incident where they'd heard that this chap, Les Marais, was on the loose and he was causing trouble. So they spent 2 weeks looking for Les Marais until it finally dawned on them there was actually a place in Guernsey called that, and it was absolutely nothing to do with a bloke who might be causing a lot of trouble, which again is another great one. But you see these recorded in because they amused people at the time and sort of lightened their mood from a very very horrible times. They had a habit of writing these things down, so you do get to see those as well, which is an interesting insight into what was going on. Some of the diaries can be, relatively boring because not a lot's happening. Because they'll record the struggles with food, record the struggles with getting fuel to heat the house, the fact they're cold, they're hungry, they can't get medicines, that sort of stuff. And you might look at a diary and for days and days there's nothing exciting happening in it, and then there'll be an absolute gem in there where they've witnessed something, or or a family member has witnessed something. There's a lot of them record the joy of seeing Cherbourg being attacked on a frequent basis. They record RAF aircraft coming over the Channel Islands, bombs being dropped, leaflets, things that happened. the, all sorts. I mean, because the other thing with knowing what was going on was that the Germans had basically taken control of the two newspapers in Guernsey and the newspaper in Jersey, and the whole front page was just basically their propaganda. They would make them print, whatever they wanted, and in fact, one of the editors actually ended up in prison because he wouldn't play ball. But again, that proved to be amusing for some of the locals because there were occasions when the Germans didn't quite get their translation right. So they'd put in what they thought was an absolutely fabulous bit of propaganda, and everybody would be saying how ridiculous. There was one where they said it was something like the German censor rocked up to the local newspaper, and the editor talks about it in his book, where they turned up with this article about they'd captured in one day they'd captured 20,000 British tanks, and it was clearly not going to be the case. But he was like, well, they told me to print it, so I'm going to print it. And then by about the middle of the day, the Germans worked out, oh, hang on a minute, why does everybody think this is amusing? And they went and got them to change it for later publication in the day. But the locals all knew that the whole front page was a complete work of fiction. It was just absolute garbage. But then when you look inside the papers, I mean, I've got a huge collection of them because I find them very interesting. You see articles about what's happened to people, all the court reports, but also you see things like recipes. People have written in with recipes because they didn't have the normal ingredients for things. It would be like, oh, we've tried making X with this, and it's not too bad. I mean, some of them just sound absolutely grim. I really wouldn't want to eat them. And I've seen somebody recreating some of these, and they didn't smell very nice either. I was only brave enough to try some acorn coffee and some bramble tea, and neither of those tasted anything like tea or coffee. But I suppose if you haven't had coffee for a couple of years, it's the nearest substitute that you can get. But they're really interesting, and you see all the people putting adverts in, bartering stuff. I've got X that I don't need. Has anybody got Y in return for what I can swap?
It's fascinating how economies shift under occupation from the direction they've been going into more of a protective self situation, people protecting themselves, self-protection movements, little barter societies, little, as you say, kind of recipes for food. It's kind of replicated in all the occupation countries to different degrees.
I mean, one account that I was reading only this morning before I went to work from one of the unpublished diaries, the chap was talking about he'd met the French captain of one of the supply boats that was coming from Normandy, and he obviously knew this chap really fairly well, because he'd met him on a number of occasions. This chap used to go to the same pub as him when he was here, overnight. And this chap actually was telling him, don't worry, I know it's really bad here, but it's pretty bad for the Germans in Normandy. They're not getting the food that they should be getting in their rations. It's pretty bad for them there. So don't worry, this will be over. In fact, in April 1941, this chap said, "Oh, the Germans are in a mess in Normandy. I predict the war will be over by Christmas." Sadly, he was wrong, but that was the sort of thing. But he also he used to bring copies of RAF leaflets that had been dropped in France. He'd bring those over with him and give them to trusted people as well, so that they could see a little bit about what's going on. He obviously got away with it, because I've not seen any account anywhere of him actually getting in trouble for that. But there were leaflet raids a little bit on the Channel Islands, but not. They kind of stopped because they were worried about what it was going to cause the Germans to do to the islanders if they got caught with them. So it changed. There were a few up until early 41, It was, you could be punished by death in theory. Nobody got death, but you could get locked up if you got caught with them.
Yeah.
Or at the very least fined. And then they changed when it got to late 1943, early 44. It was very much about dropping leaflets that were targeting the Germans, which said, you know, it's all going wrong for you. You know, they're telling you lies. You don't know, you know, you should all give up. Not that it made any difference, but there we go. But that's kind of where that changed.
So I want to end on the fortifications and the museums and everything that exists today. But before we get there, you mentioned John Nettles. People obviously know him from Bergerac, and I think the other one is it Midsummer Nights.
That's the Midsummer Murders. Yeah.
So what's his thing over in the Channel Islands? Is he still highly regarded, respected? Has he brought clamour and glamour and everything to the story? I mean,
no, he's done some really good work. He's got a book called Jules and Jackboots, which came out a few years ago, which is actually a really interesting read about what was going on. He spent a lot of time researching it. His love of it obviously came about when he was filming Bergerac, and he spent a lot of time doing things like that. He edited the old book. He's got another book coming out actually. Not entirely sure when. I think it's kind of autumn this year, about one of the Germans that was here. He's taken the diaries of a German that he's then there was an iteration of that published some years ago, but a lot of it was taken out. And I believe that he's just basically gone back and said, no, we should publish all of this. We need to show what was actually going through this guy's mind. So I'm looking forward to that coming out. We're hopefully getting him on our podcast actually to come and talk about him. I've met him a few times. Really nice chat. Really just deeply interested in what happened in the history of the islands. He's done a couple of documentaries as well. You can find them on YouTube if you Google them. Where he talks about, stories that he's looked at, and he interviews people as well that were around during the occupation. Sadly, there's very few of those people left now. Because the passage of time. I was very lucky. I interviewed a lady called Melva Stacey, who's 95, who was a teenager towards the end of the occupation. I interviewed her back in May, and we put it out on our podcast. She's bright as a button, still lives in her own apartment, still drives a car, and she was brilliant. She just it was possibly one of the easiest interviews I've ever done, because I sat down with her. Her daughter had arranged this for me. She said, Mum's not really talked about it before, but she now feels like she wants to. Would you be interested? And it's like, you don't have to ask me twice. But I sat down with Melva in her lounge, and I said, look, these are the kind of things I'd like to talk about. Is that okay with you? And basically, I asked the first question, and for the next 45 minutes, she basically covered absolutely everything that I'd mentioned, and it was brilliant, because she was able to tell some, really personal stories, and things that had happened to her family, to her friends, their worries, and things that that they'd done to amuse themselves. So that was fab. But unfortunately, I say there's very few people now that are left. There's just a handful. But there are quite a few that have been interviewed that are on YouTube. If you Google Channel Islands occupation, you can find quite a few of the people that were involved in. Some of them particularly were involved in sort of passive resistance, stroke defiance, and people that there were a lot of people in Jersey particularly where they had, at one point they had about 130 Russian slave workers and Ukrainian slave workers that were on the run because they'd done a runner, and there was a whole network of people that protected them, and some of them got away with not being caught. But it was very, very risky, and one lady got sent to a concentration camp, unfortunately, for doing just that.
Yeah, people will say, well, you didn't go down that route. I wanted to talk to you about the island and the other stories, because I think if you look on YouTube or wherever you get your kind of content from, out there's a lot on the deportations, the Jews, the occupation, the collaboration. There isn't a sense of the islands, you know.
No,
yeah. And I think people find me odd, I think, because I like to understand the culture of the area and the terrain and the landscape and the people before I actually start delving into coming up with some weird and wonderful conclusions. I mean, okay, it took me 25 years to write a book about Aachen and living here for 25 years, but it was only in the last maybe 5-10 years I began to understand the nuances as an Aachener, you know, and
yeah.
and the history changes. You go in thinking one thing and suddenly it deflects in another direction. And it struck me in preparation for the talk, there's all that collaboration out there. And I know when we first started talking, I talked about my relationship with Bunny Panchev's wife. I mean, it's absolutely no relevance to what happened in the Channel Islands. People know that I have got this knowledge, but I think it was more interesting that we talk about the culture, the island, the people, getting a sense of the place, which is, if you don't mind me asking, the last thing tonight would be to you tell us about the fortresses and the museums and what's there.
We're
Entice us to come and visit you.
Absolutely. Visit Guernsey. Will be pleased to welcome you. There is so much to see. You can't get away from it. At the end of the war, they did toy with the idea of trying to get rid of some of this horrible reminder. Had a quick go at blowing up a couple of bunkers and went, this is a bit difficult. We're going to need too much explosive. It's going to be too dangerous. So gave up, which thankfully that did. Now, a lot of stuff got taken away during the scrap drive, but there were a lot of people that managed to get their hands on stuff and have restored bunkers. There's an organization called Feston Guernsey who do a lot of good work. They're restoring one of the big gun batteries, Mirus, which had guns with a range of 30 miles. Huge guns. They're restoring that. It's really worth going to see. You have to go on an organised tour for that. But they've done lots of other things as well. So there's a naval signals tower like the one behind you and in the photo there that's been restored, that you can just go and have a look around. It's got all the kit in it that would have been in there during the war. It's got some great explanations of what happened. You can even go up on the roof if you're feeling brave and you want to go up the ladder. It's not recommended on a windy day. But Richard Yome runs the Occupation Museum, and that is just a treasure trove of things. If you want to go and understand everything from the weapons that he's got in the museum through to what it was like, he's got recreations of a sitting room, recreations of the high street in St. Peterport as it would have looked, and just so much information. And he's more than happy to chat to people about what he knows about the occupation. And he's a really interesting guy. We've got the German Naval Signals headquarters here, which has been completely restored, and that's a fascinating place. They actually sent a signal from here to say they detected the D-Day invasion fleet with the radars here, and for whatever reason, it never got acted upon because they sent that at about 1:45 on the 5th of June. And because they could also see all of the aircraft coming over the islands. They were coming between the islands, going down, coming back up and through Normandy rather than going straight over the coast. So there's that. We've got Castle Cornet, which is a lovely castle down in St. Peterport off the harbour. That's got so much history. It goes back to, I think, about 1200. But the Germans being one for recycling things like weapons that they captured, they also recycled fortifications because they looked at it and went, well, if somebody's put a whopping huge castle here, it's probably there for a reason. And so there's a lot of German additions to what was there. So there's loads of history. We've got loads of really good tour guides that will, gladly come and take people on a tour that know a vast amount of things they can get you access to bunkers that aren't generally open to the public or are open only a few times a year. You can just go and have a look. There's so many good guidebooks. You can just go for a mooch and have a look at some of them, some of the bunkers and things. So there is a lot to do, and we've got lots of great restaurants as well. So at the end of the day, after you've been going around looking at all these things, you can go and have a lovely meal.
Yeah, I have seen your food pictures, and I thought to myself, yeah, but beautiful sky, seaside, beautiful food. I mean, must be a delight.
Yeah, I mean, we are very lucky. I'm an accountant, and I used to work a lot with people in London, and I made it a rule that I was not going to London in July, August, or September. It was just like, this is not happening. And they'd be like, oh, why? I don't really. And I'm like, no, it's the summer in Guernsey. I can be on the beach 10 minutes after I leave the office, or I can be on my kayak, 10, 15 minutes, having a nice paddle around in the hot weather, or I could be in London on a tube train. Let me see. And then a lot of them actually, when they got to come to Guernsey, were like, yeah, okay, we totally get why you don't like coming to London in the summer. it's like, yeah, this is just brilliant. And the fact that my commute's 10 minutes, which is just, I used to frequently get, when I was doing training and things in the UK, frequently get people saying, oh no, how long's your commute? And I'll be like, well, about 10, 15 minutes. And say, right, how do you get to work? It's like, well, I drive in my car and I go and park at the office. And they're like, what? So yeah, there is that. But there's loads of great cliff paths to walk as well. There's so many different things that you can do, and lots of different history from Napoleonic times. So we've got a lot of Napoleonic fortifications as well. So there's all sorts. There's something for everybody, really.
Yeah, I mean, it to me, it's always looked a delight. And so I nearly went one time, and the ferry was cancelled, and we ended up in Cherbourg. But I'm sure one day I will make an attempt to come and visit the islands.
Well, I'd be happy to show you around, Phil.
That would be great. And likewise, if you come to Aachen, you can have the Woody tour, which is currywurst and beers.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Having been on Woody's tours in Normandy and had a few beers with him and a few others. That sounds great fun.
Well, look, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And it's been a delight listening to everything that you've had to say. And I look forward to reading your book. And you say that's coming out in autumn, yes?
No, that will be out next year sometime.
Oh, okay. Your deadline is next year. Sorry, yeah.
My deadline.
I got confused with John Nettles because you say in his book.
Yeah, his is
right.
The book will be out sometime next year. The deadline for me to get it to the publisher is end of January. But if people want to find other things, they can find my blog on islandfortress.com, and which happily, if you Google anything to do with the occupation of the Channel Islands, comes up very high up the rankings without me really making too much effort other than writing lots of content.
No, that is a good site, and we are going to put you up on our webpage.
And if they'd rather listen to things while they're doing other things, I've got a podcast called Islands at War, which Keith and I took, as I mentioned earlier, we talk about what it was like for people who lived here, and the pressures that were on them, and just day-to-day life, which seems to be going well. We're getting a lot of positive feedback from people, just that they didn't know any of this stuff, and it's just really interesting. We get a lot of American listeners actually. I look at the stats, and it's the UK and Guernsey come out in the top two, but then third is America.
Right.
It's great to have people supporting that. We weren't quite sure how it was going to work. It was like we kind of learned podcasting from scratch, and then went, okay, let's give this a go, and it seems to be going all right. So
So I'm very pleased to hear it, and I hope the success continues.
Thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
No, it's been great. Nick, thank you very much. I'm going to stop now, say goodbye to folks, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers then, Nick. Thank you very much.
Cheers.